We are now joined in studio by Africa Director for International Commission of Jurists, Arnold Tsunga. Arnold, thank you so much for joining us. Now, South Africa revoking the ICC withdrawal. Can you briefly explain what this means in layman's terms?
Yes, I can. You know, South Africa is a member of the International Criminal Court in terms of the Rome Statute. And because of some unhappiness that they had about the way in which the International Criminal Court was conducting its proceedings, the government had made a decision to withdraw from the ICC. That in itself raises two issues. Firstly, there has to be a withdrawal process that is in accordance with the law. And then if that happens, then it means South Africa will be given 12 months from the time they file a notice of withdrawal for the withdrawal to take effect. After 12 months, then South Africa ceases to be a member of the ICC Rome Statute, and therefore the obligations that pertain to it as a member will then fall away. But the problem that South Africa experienced was that the decision was not made procedurally. It was made by cabinet. It was unconstitutional, and once that process was challenged, it meant that the court had to make a decision on whether the notice that was filed by the government of South Africa was actually a valid notice or not. And unfortunately for the government, the High Court made a decision that there was no compliance with the Constitution, and therefore the notice was a nullity. So what has now happened in the past 24 hours is that the government has now tried to rectify that problem by complying with the High Court order, by withdrawing the withdrawal notice. The effect of that is that the matter is not yet finished. It means that the government, if it still wants to proceed politically with the withdrawal, it then has to do procedures that comply with the Constitution, which means going back to Parliament. And that's exactly what they are promising to do, which in itself is very unfortunate, because South Africa is such an important country in Africa, and it must show leadership in the fight against impunity. And I think the notice of intention to withdraw, when we don't have an effective mechanism on the African continent to fight impunity, it sends a very wrong signal.
Now, let's speak about this whole process, going back to Parliament now and taking it step by step for South Africa, if South Africa decides to continue with the withdrawal. Another 12-month period, and then going forward, what really needs to happen in terms of that process for everything to come into effect?
So they have to do a parliamentary process that seeks parliamentary authority to give direction to the government to withdraw. So that is the process that they want to be doing now. It means that essentially there has to be a process where they invite even the public to participate in the process of bills that allow for South Africa to withdraw. They've already started a process right now where, as of today, the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services had invited the public to file submissions in response to a bill that has been initiated in Parliament for the repeal of the International Criminal Court Implementation Act. That process, if it is done and it succeeds in Parliament, then which means South Africa can legally pull out of the ICC. The process, it can take anything from a few months to 12 months. But the thing is that, just to clear the initial thing about the 12 months, if this parliamentary process succeeds, it means that the executive will now have authority to file a notice of withdrawal properly with the International Criminal Court. And it is only from that notice that the 12 months can count, whilst the ICC Act is actually binding on South Africa. But really, I don't think that's a process that really South Africa needs to be burdening itself with. This is why the International Commission of Jurists, together with leading jurists, judges from the retired judges from the Constitutional Court of South Africa, filed a submission to Parliament which deals with all the reasons that South Africa has given as reasons why they want to pull out of the ICC, virtually dismissing each and every of those reasons as not valid, and therefore making a recommendation South Africa must remain within the ICC.
Now, just speaking of those submissions by the group of retired judges, do you feel this is enough to sway parliamentarians, especially from withdrawing?
You know what, the weight and seriousness of the people who signed that submission, you know, these are people who have a demonstrable record of service, public service to this country, to build the national value system, the vision of South Africa as a country that is a leader in Africa in terms of promotion of human rights. And so they really have nothing to gain by doing what they've done. And as the Africa director of the ICJ, I haven't seen in any country where people of this stature get seized with an issue of public interest and express themselves as strongly as they have done. I think it will be folly for the parliamentarians not to give proper weight and substance to the contents of the submission that has been made by these judges.
Now, Arnold, let's just touch on some of the reasons why South Africa wants to withdraw from the ICC. Are there valid reasons, and is there another way of dealing with issues within the ICC instead of withdrawing?
Emphatically, I can say there is no valid reason to withdraw. But I can also say emphatically that there is need for the ICC to reflect seriously on its own operational modalities so that it can be truly global in the way in which it tackles impunity on the globe. ICC is supposed to be a court of last resort, which means it has got a complementary relationship with the judiciaries at the domestic level. ICC will not intervene in any country unless there is evidence of unwillingness and inability on the part of the domestic judicial legal system to deal with impunity. So in terms of the fact that ICC is seen as having focused to deal with Africa and not dealt with other serious problems elsewhere in the world, I really think that the ICC has to review and look at itself seriously so that it can be a global institution. But I think the fact that the ICC has not, for example, looked at the situation in Syria, that cannot be an excuse for the ICC not to look at a situation like in the DRC. In the DRC, when the ICC was formed in 1998, a conflict has continued from 98 up to 2008, when the International Rescue Committee made a calculation of the casualties of that conflict. 5.4 million people died from the adoption of the Rome Statute up to 2008. And there's no legal capacity of the system in the DRC to deal with those that are responsible for those types of killings. And there's no other system in Africa. There's no African court with the jurisdiction and functionality to deal with those types of cases. This is why I think the ICC has to be a court of last resort, and South Africa must preserve it and deal with the imperfections through a reform process.
Now, just looking at South Africa as a country and looking at other African countries on the continent that also came out and said they were also looking at withdrawing from the ICC, countries such as Burundi, do you think now that South Africa is going through a process of decision making with parliamentarians having to be involved, do you think these countries that have also shown interest in withdrawing from the ICC will change their minds?
Yeah, you say, I saw you smiling when you said Burundi. I think it sounds very unfortunate to be putting South Africa in the same basket as Burundi in terms of fighting impunity. You know, Burundi is a rogue state. It's a state where there's no respect for democracy. It's a state where the president of that country is at the forefront of deploying military arsenal and assets to endanger its own civilians. And when South Africa made the decision to withdraw, it was not surprising that Burundi was the first country to follow that leadership. Then Yaya Jammeh in the Gambia was the next to follow. But once there was a democratic process in the Gambia that resulted in a sober government that cared about its own people, they didn't even waste time to withdraw the withdrawal from the ICC. Now you only have South Africa and Gambia and Burundi remaining as countries in Africa, notwithstanding the public rhetoric of the African Union wanting to pull out of the ICC. These are the two countries that have filed. The rest of the African countries, which is 30, there were 34 of them. So 32 have remained firmly within the ICC Rome Statute and without taking any steps at all to show an intention to pull out. I need to also say that the African Union itself, yes, at the AU level, they've made a decision that they must do a withdrawal strategy. That's the caption of the document they produced. But if you just look through it, you will see that in paragraph 7 of that document, they actually say the objective of that strategy is to ensure that there can be appropriate reform of the ICC. So you can't be withdrawing from an institution whose objective you are actually trying to reform. So in essence, there is a desire for reform, and I really think that it's important to reform not just the ICC, but also, many of the United Nations and multilateral systems, so that they can function better for society. But to answer you more directly, Africa, through Senegal, the Minister of Justice, Sidiki Kaba, is the chairperson of the Assembly of State Parties of the ICC. And the rest of the African countries have not shown any desire or any movement at all to move out of the ICC. It is only South Africa. And I really think we need to disabuse the notion that justice is a threat to peace. Justice and peace are complementary objectives that can be achieved by this country.
Now, in terms of just looking at that and South Africa's reaction with the AU and the AU calling for reform of the ICC's way of doing things, do you think that if there's a decision or the ICC comes to the party and says, yes, definitely we will review some of our decisions and look at a different direction and sort of work towards what African countries are complaining about, and South Africa, for instance, do you think South Africa may backtrack?
No, I also need to clear a few misconceptions. First thing, the African Union as a geopolitical entity is not a member of the ICC. Yes. It's a member that stands side by side as a multilateral institution with 55 member states, including the entry of Morocco recently. Yes. And then the ICC itself, 34 African countries are members of the ICC. So which means you have two multilateral bodies that have got representation from African countries. It's not possible for the ICC to give a direction on what the AU must do. Neither is it legally possible for the AU to give direction what the ICC should do. So the rhetoric coming from the African Union about an instruction, about an institution to which it is not a member, is not valid. And practically, it's really in the diplomatic rhetoric and the propaganda. Then the reality also is that the situations that the ICC has been dealing with in Africa, the majority of them were referred to the ICC by the African member states of the ICC themselves. So it's not like the ICC imposed itself. It only dealt with an additional, I think, 2 cases out of the 5, where there was a referral by the United Nations Security Council. And in that situation, it is the UN that refers, but the referral by the United Nations Security Council does not automatically mean that the ICC gets seized. They simply refer, and the ICC uses its own discretion. Firstly, the prosecutorial discretion to assess whether there is a case to answer. Secondly, judicial oversight over prosecutorial discretion to say, as a prosecutor, you want us to authorize you to deal with this case. What facts do you have? And once the judiciary at the ICC level makes that evaluation, then they make a decision. So at that point, it is actually the ICC that is making a decision. What is true is that the ICC has more cases in Africa than anywhere else. That is not necessarily a misdirection. but it may be an issue that attracts negative attention to the ICC on the basis that why are you focusing on Africa when there are other problems elsewhere? And so this is where the reform of the ICC may be useful, so that it looks and presents itself as a global entity, looking at Syria, looking at Palestine, which is what it is already doing. It's now seized with Palestine, it's seized with Syria, it's looking at other cases in the Ukraine area where Russia is involved. So I really think we need to be able to separate propaganda from reality.
Now, Arnold, unfortunately, we are running out of time, but very quickly, the issue of the South Africans who are appearing at the ICC with regards to the Sudanese President al-Bashir's arrest and why he was not arrested when he came to South Africa for an AU summit. What do you think is going to happen then? What do you think their response is going to be?
I think South Africa is going to raise the argument that they've always raised, that the law of diplomatic immunities requires that South Africa recognizes the immunity of a head of state if he is still recognized as a legitimate head. But unfortunately, the Rome Statute, when it was crafted, was meant to target those who bear the greatest responsibility for the violations of rights. And therefore, the members of the ICC, including South Africa, consciously removed diplomatic immunity for the heads of state. So being a head of state is not a basis for immunity, and South Africa knew it. So their mistake, diplomatically, was to invite Bashir. And once they invited, they then had to face the consequences. And so once you invite a criminal and you have got domestic and international obligations to arrest, you cannot then make noise that the institution is not fair, because this is a very organized government with brilliant minds. They knew, they took a risk, and that's exactly what they're going to face when they go to The Hague on the 7th of April.
Arnold, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that was Arnold Tsunga, Africa Director for International Commission of Jurists, joining us live.